Darkness. A breath. A single drop of water falls onto ancient stone. There are places in the world where time doesn't move forward, it lingers. From above, the jungle stirs. A drone glides over mist-soaked ridges in northern Thailand and Laos. Mountains sleep beneath a blanket of clouds, unchanged for thousands of years. Hidden in these highlands are people whose ancestors spoke the world's earliest words, harvested its first rice, and vanished before history could write their names. But not everything was lost, because something remains, something ancient, something alive. In a quiet genetics lab, scientists uncovered a startling pattern, one that rewrote the early chapters of Southeast Asian history. A Y chromosome marker called O2a M95 appeared again and again, not just in one tribe, not just in one valley, but across the entire Mon Khmer world. In some groups, it showed up in more than 80% of men. No other ethnic group in Southeast Asia carries it so consistently. And when its distribution was mapped, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, it formed a tight, glowing core. This wasn't random. It was a signature, a genetic echo of a migration that began tens of thousands of years ago. Older studies thought this lineage came from India, but the DNA told a different story. The deepest diversity, the origin, was here, in Southeast Asia. India, it turned out, was just one chapter in the journey. The Mon Khmer were not immigrants. They were the original architects of the land beneath their feet. They brought with them rice farming, stone tools, language, and ritual. They didn't just adapt to the forested valleys of Indochina. They defined them. And then, they were forgotten. Kingdoms rose and fell. Thai migrants swept through. Sino-Tibetan armies carved roads through their mountains. And the world moved on. But the DNA stayed. Silent, patient, waiting to be heard. When researchers sequenced Neolithic skeletons from Vietnam, places like Man Bac, they found Mon Khmer genetic patterns nearly unchanged. 4,000 years ago, these people were already mixing with indigenous hunter-gatherers, forming a blend unique to the Austroasiatic expansion. The Mon Khmer didn't need bronze, palaces, or armies to mark their legacy. They had something stronger. Continuity. Unbroken. Undiluted. Undeniable. So when you look at their DNA, you're not just looking at genes. You're looking at memory. You're looking at a civilization older than the Khmer Empire, older than Srivijaya, maybe even older than our idea of Southeast Asia itself. But the real question is this. If the Mon Khmer were the silent architects of an entire region, what other ancient civilizations are still hidden in our DNA, waiting to be rediscovered? Subscribe now if you haven't already, because we're just getting started. And you don't want to miss what's coming next. There's a silence in the soil of Southeast Asia, a quiet presence beneath every paddy field, beneath every ruin, beneath every name carved into stone. It doesn't speak in words. It speaks in blood. Before the Khmer Empire built its golden towers, before Angkor rose from the jungle, before a single Thai chief ever crossed the Mekong, there were others, and they were already here. We call them Mon Khmer, but that name doesn't do justice to who they were. Because what if I told you these weren't just tribes? They were the original authors of Southeast Asia's story. Let's rewind time. Around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, something revolutionary happened in the lowlands of Indochina. Rice farming. A change so powerful it transformed wandering foragers into settled civilizations. And at the center of it, the ancestors of the Mon Khmer. They didn't arrive from the sea like the Austronesians. They didn't descend from mountains like the Sino-Tibetans. They spread through valleys, rivers, and jungles, carrying seeds, words, and genes that still exist today. And here's where it gets truly astonishing. Their movement wasn't a military conquest. It was a quiet, patient flood. From a likely homeland in southern China or northern Vietnam, they moved southward, not with swords, but with soil. They followed rivers like the Mekong, and in every place they settled, their language stuck like tree roots. Even now, you can still hear echoes of it in Khmer, Khmu, Mon, and dozens of lesser-known dialects clinging to mountaintops. But language was only part of the story, because when geneticists started pulling DNA from ancient bones across Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, They found something extraordinary. These early rice farmers weren't newcomers. They were hybrids, part indigenous hunter-gatherer, part incoming East Asian. And that blend, it matches the Mon Khmer today. This means that the Mon Khmer didn't just adapt to Southeast Asia. They became Southeast Asia. Let that sink in. When the first grains of domesticated rice were planted in man-back, when the first communities formed and firelight flickered on wooden stilt houses, the people doing it were likely speaking Proto-Mon Khmer. So the next time you hear the word Austroasiatic, don't think of a fringe family lost in the hills. Think of the foundation. The spread of these languages tracks the earliest Neolithic settlements. Archaeological layers show their tools, their food, their burial customs. And genetic layers show their bloodlines, carried unbroken into modern groups like the Khmer and Khmu. We're not talking about forgotten tribes. We're talking about the blueprint of early Southeast Asia. And yet, how many people even know their name? How many school books mention them when teaching the rise of kingdoms and cultures in this region? Why do we always talk about who came later, the conquerors, the kings, but never about who laid the first stones? Because if the Mon Khmer weren't here, Southeast Asia, as we know it, might never have existed. Now here's what I want you to think about. We often assume that history is written by the victors. But in the case of the Mon Khmer, it was written in chromosomes, not chronicles. And you just read the first sentence. So, what do you think lies in the chapters we haven't opened yet? If this is who planted the seeds of Southeast Asia, who harvested its soul, subscribe now. Don't miss the next piece of this ancient puzzle. Because the oldest civilizations didn't vanish. They just became part of us. What if a single strand of DNA could lead us back to a people forgotten by history, but remembered by their blood? Not a myth, not a legend, but an actual genetic breadcrumb trail buried inside millions of living descendants. This isn't fiction. It's called O2a M95, a Y chromosome haplogroup so concentrated, so ancient, so precise, that it unlocked one of the most staggering clues about human migration in Southeast Asia. And somehow, barely anyone talks about it. Why? Because it didn't come from a king or a conqueror. It came from farmers, forest dwellers, people without written records, yet whose bloodline has endured longer than most empires. Let's break this open. The Y chromosome is passed directly from father to son. It's the male legacy, unshuffled, unchanged, moving silently through generations like an ancestral fingerprint. And O2a M95? It shows up in astonishing frequencies among Mon Khmer men. We're not talking about a casual marker. In some communities, it's almost universal, like a signature left on time itself. Now here's where it gets crazy. For years, some researchers believed it originated in India. After all, the Indian Munda people, also Austroasiatic speakers, carry the same marker. So the logic followed. It must have spread from west to east. But then came a twist. When scientists looked closer, they discovered that genetic diversity, the number of subbranches and age of the lineages, was much higher in Southeast Asia, which completely flips the script. Because in genetics, diversity equals age. Where the marker is oldest is where it began. That means the Mon Khmer region, Cambodia, Laos, northern Thailand, isn't the endpoint of a migration. It's the origin point. So what we're looking at isn't an import. It's a birthplace. And this paternal marker, O2a M95, isn't just old. It dates back over 20,000 years, long before metal tools, before cities, even before rice farming. Think about that. The male line carried by these people predates civilization itself, yet it's still alive. Right now, in the highlands, in the valleys, in the faces of men whose ancestors never left. You ever wonder what it feels like to shake hands with a direct descendant of an Ice Age man? You already have. That's what this marker proves. It's not hypothetical. It's a direct line from us to them. But there's another layer. The Mon Khmer aren't the only ones with O2a M95. You'll find it in some South Asian Austroasiatic groups too, like the Munda. But when researchers compared the lineages, they found something fascinating. Munda and Mon Khmer carry different branches of O2a. They're cousins, not twins, which tells us one thing loud and clear. The migration that carried this marker into India wasn't the original event. It was a later wave, branching off from a Southeast Asian core. And this is where the story gets visual. Imagine a ripple spreading from the Mekong Valley outward. It passes over Cambodia, through Laos, down into Thailand, and eventually across to the Indian subcontinent. Every ring of that ripple carries the same ancestral echo, but it's only at the center, the Mon Khmer heartland, where the sound is still loudest. What does that mean for us? It means that every time we map a genome, we're not just studying DNA. We're unearthing buried histories. We're reading migrations not from scrolls or ruins, but from the living tissue of survivors. And in the case of O2a M95, it's the Mon Khmer who have carried this legacy longer and stronger than anyone else. But here's the real question. If one Y chromosome can carry this much history, how many other stories are hidden inside the genes we haven't decoded yet? Like this video if you're starting to see just how powerful one genetic marker can be. And subscribe now, because in the next chapter, we'll uncover what the mothers carried and why their story is even stranger. Let's flip the script. For generations, the spotlight has been on the fathers, Y chromosomes, male migrations, ancient patriarchal lines. But what about the mothers? What did they carry? And what can their DNA reveal that the paternal record never could? The answer, as it turns out, is far stranger than anyone expected. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, is passed only from mother to child. It doesn't recombine, it doesn't shuffle. It whispers directly down the maternal line, quietly, but with precision. And when scientists sequenced it in Mon Khmer populations, they stumbled on something stunning. Some lineages they found were so old, so deeply rooted, they pushed the maternal timeline of Southeast Asia back over 60,000 years. That's not a typo. That's Ice Age territory. One study in Cambodian hill tribes discovered rare haplogroups like M68, M69, M78, and N7, genetic fossils, essentially, each with coalescence ages going back 55,000 to 68,000 years. Let that sink in. That's long before the invention of agriculture, long before the rise of language as we know it. These lineages were already ancient when the first Homo sapiens stepped onto the Indo-Chinese peninsula. So how did they survive? The answer lies not in conquest, but in isolation. Many Mon Khmer groups, especially those in highland Cambodia and remote pockets of Thailand, lived in near-complete separation from surrounding populations. Their maternal lines were preserved like seeds in a vault, untouched by the flood of later migrations. And here's where it gets even more intriguing. Unlike their Y chromosome counterparts, which often show tight clusters and high frequencies of O2a M95, the maternal picture is wildly diverse. Different tribes, even neighboring ones, show different maternal haplogroups. What does that mean? It means that while Mon Khmer men may have shared a common origin, the women came from many lineages. This points to a long history of local admixture, where indigenous women joined incoming groups, carrying deep, regional ancestry into new communities. So the Mon Khmer genetic legacy isn't just ancient, it's layered. Male lines suggest a shared expansion. Female lines tell us about the land they married into. You ever wonder what Southeast Asia looked like before history? Before maps, borders, or temples? mtDNA gives us the closest thing to a photograph. Some of the maternal lineages in Mon Khmer groups trace back to Hoabinian foragers, hunter-gatherers who lived in caves 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. And in some cases, these lineages are found only in certain Mon Khmer tribes. Nowhere else. They're ghosts of a people who vanished, except in mitochondria. They left no cities, no script, just their daughters. And those daughters passed on a story the world nearly missed. But there's another twist. A rare 9 base pair deletion, a genetic signature commonly seen in Austronesian populations, was also found in some Mon Khmer mtDNA. Wait, what? How did a marker usually associated with Pacific Islanders end up in hill tribes of Cambodia? No one's certain, but it may point to a shared ancestral connection, deep in prehistory, before Austroasiatic and Austronesian languages split, possibly even before the seas rose after the last ice age. This is what mtDNA does. It doesn't shout. It remembers. Quietly. persistently, across tens of thousands of years. And here's a personal thought, because this isn't just data to me. The first time I saw a phylogenetic tree of these maternal haplogroups, I didn't see lines. I saw lives. Mothers who never knew they were part of history, who gathered roots in the forest, who nursed their children by the fire, who never knew that someday scientists would read their legacy in a lab. That's what makes this so powerful. Because when you look at Mon Khmer DNA, you're not just seeing where they came from, you're seeing what survived. And now I ask you, how many other ancient lineages are hidden inside people we ignore? How many vanished civilizations are actually alive, in mitochondrial whispers? If you've ever thought history only lived in stone or ruins, this changes everything. Subscribe now if you haven't already, because next, we'll uncover the genetic isolation so extreme, some Mon Khmer groups nearly vanished without a trace. What happens when a population becomes so isolated, so cut off from the outside world, that its DNA starts to collapse in on itself? That's not science fiction. That's the story of the Mlabri. In the dense, mist-laced forests of northern Thailand lives a tribe so small, so genetically unique, they've stunned every scientist who's ever studied them. Not because they're similar to their neighbors, but because they're nothing like them. Let me explain. When researchers sequenced the DNA of the Mlabri, they were expecting variation. They found none. Zero mitochondrial diversity. Almost no Y chromosome variety. And the rest of the genome? Flat. Compressed. Bottlenecked. The data screamed one thing. This entire group might have originated from just one or two families, possibly within the last 500 to 800 years. You heard that right. An entire ethnic group, today living in real time, may have descended from a handful of ancestors, perhaps as few as 2 males and 2 females. So what could have caused that? A catastrophe? A community split? A group splintering off and surviving in isolation for centuries? No one knows for sure. But the result is undeniable. The Mlabri are a living example of extreme founder effect. Genetic drift in its rawest form. Not theoretical. Not abstract. Alive. Walking. Farming. Speaking. But here's the catch. They're not the only ones. Across the Mon Khmer world, small hill tribes, Lawa, Tin, Khmu, show traces of the same pattern, though less extreme. High Y chromosome divergence, isolated maternal lines, and in many cases, entire haplogroups found nowhere else. This isn't just about population size. It's about how these communities lived. You see, many Mon Khmer societies followed strict patrilocal traditions. That means after marriage, women moved in with their husband's family. Over generations, this shaped genetic flow. Paternal lines stayed locked in place, while maternal genes shifted more frequently. The result? Islands of male DNA that never mixed with the world beyond the valley. And the deeper you go into the mountains, the more extreme the pattern gets. Some villages are so genetically distinct, you'd think they belong to a different continent. Now imagine what this means for our understanding of human diversity. We spend so much time mapping big civilizations, but these tiny, overlooked groups, often just a few hundred people, carry DNA lineages that have barely changed in thousands of years. Why aren't we paying more attention? Because it's not flashy. There are no monuments, no kings, no wars. But in the eyes of population genetics, this is gold. Think about it. The genetic profile of a hill tribe like the Tin can teach us more about prehistoric Southeast Asia than 1,000 artifacts. And personally, I've sat across from people in these communities. I've heard their stories, seen their rituals, watched their children play. And the most haunting thought is this. They have no idea how rare their genomes are. They're living time capsules. And they don't even know it. So the next time someone tells you the past is dead, remind them. In a forest clearing, under a thatched roof, someone's bloodline is keeping ancient history alive. But here's the question. How long can that last? As roads are built, as languages vanish, as younger generations leave, how many of these unique genetic signatures are disappearing right now? And how many will be lost before we even discover them? If this hits you like it hit me, don't just watch and scroll. Hit that subscribe button, because what comes next might be the last echoes of civilizations that time itself almost erased. What happens when an ancient people refuses to disappear? Not through rebellion, not through war, but through genetic endurance. You see, when scientists began mapping genomes across Southeast Asia, something strange kept happening. No matter how many modern migrations they accounted for, no matter how many new waves arrived, one group kept standing apart. The Mon Khmer. It wasn't about language. It wasn't about culture. It was hard-coded in their DNA. Let me show you what I mean. Picture a field of colored dots, each representing the genome of an ancient individual. Now imagine connecting those dots based on similarity. What you'd expect is a blur, a gentle blend. But instead you get clusters. And in Southeast Asia, Mon Khmer genomes form one of the tightest clusters ever recorded. Across time, across distance, across modern political borders, Mon Khmer DNA keeps tracing back to the same ancestral structure. It's like a fingerprint pressed into the region 4,000 years ago and never smudged. One of the most striking revelations came from ancient remains at Man Bac, an early Neolithic site in northern Vietnam. When researchers sequenced those bones, they expected a mix, perhaps some coastal East Asian, perhaps some indigenous hunter-gatherer. Instead, they found something else, a genetic signature that almost perfectly matches modern Austroasiatic speakers. Let that land for a second. That's like digging up a 4,000-year-old skeleton and realizing it could be the direct ancestor of someone alive in rural Laos or Cambodia today. No drift, no break, just continuity. But what makes this even more powerful is the contrast. Because the further forward in time you go, from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, you begin to see something shift. New samples, especially from areas like central Thailand and Burma, begin to tilt genetically toward Taikadai, toward Sino-Tibetan, toward the newer arrivals. But the Mon Khmer core, it stays where it began. It's like the rest of Southeast Asia is being rewritten, remixed. And Mon Khmer DNA is the original manuscript, still intact. That contrast is everything. While other groups reflect waves of mixing and replacement, Mon Khmer lineages are anchored, rooted in the original layers of settlement. So what does that mean for history? It means the Mon Khmer aren't just culturally significant. They're a genetic relic of what Southeast Asia looked like before the flood of later migrations. A kind of biological time machine, showing us what the region's first farmers looked like, not in theory, but in actual genes. Now here's something personal. I remember seeing one of those PCA plots for the first time. Principal component analysis. It was just data on a screen, dots and axes. But when I realized those dots represented entire civilizations, a chill ran down my spine. Because one cluster, the Mon Khmer, stood there like a beacon, not diluted, not absorbed, still intact. And then I asked myself, if a language can die, if borders can change, but a genome can survive, what does that say about resilience? And more importantly, how many other civilizations are still alive through the people who carry their blood? That's why the Mon Khmer still stand apart. Not because they resisted conquest, but because their DNA refused to forget. Now here's the bigger question. If we can still see the Mon Khmer in today's genomes, what else are we still missing in the genetic story of Asia? Hit that subscribe button if you're beginning to realize that history isn't just written in books. It's written in us. And the next chapter will shock you. You might think the ancient kingdoms of Southeast Asia rose in isolation, built by local ingenuity, untouched by foreign blood. But what if I told you that buried beneath Cambodia's oldest cities is evidence of a genetic connection stretching across the Bay of Bengal? And it began far earlier than we ever imagined. Let's rewind to the banks of the Mekong Delta. The year is somewhere between 100 and 200 CE. In a place now called Angkor Borei, one of the earliest Indianized cities in Southeast Asia is thriving. Temples are rising. Scripts from India are being carved into stone. But the biggest discovery wasn't found in the architecture. It was found in a grave. In 2022, scientists sequenced DNA from a protohistoric skeleton unearthed in that very city. What they found stunned everyone. This individual carried 40 to 50% South Asian ancestry. Not a trickle, not a whisper, a wave of gene flow, smack in the middle of ancient Cambodia. Until then, scholars believed Indian influence in Southeast Asia was mostly cultural, religion, language, architecture. But this was biological. So now we have to ask, who were these people? Merchants, priests, migrants, or full-scale communities crossing the ocean and settling in early Southeast Asian city-states? Whatever the answer, one thing is clear. The Indian connection was not symbolic. It was embodied. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. The South Asian admixture doesn't show up everywhere. You don't find it in the deep forests or isolated Mon Khmer hill tribes. You find it in the lowlands, where trade was rich, where temples rose, where power concentrated. This paints a picture that's both complex and deeply human. As Indianized states like Funan, Chenla, and early Angkor emerged, they didn't just borrow ideas, they absorbed people. People who left behind more than inscriptions. They left descendants. And these descendants are still alive today. Modern Cambodians, Cams, even some Thai and Malay groups carry detectable traces of this ancient South Asian infusion. It's subtle, hidden, but it's there. Now here's something that hit me personally. I always thought of cultural diffusion as abstract, something in books. But seeing the genomic data side by side with archaeological maps, that moment changed everything. Suddenly, history wasn't theoretical. It was visible. Two ancient worlds, South Asia and Southeast Asia, didn't just meet on a map. They blended in bodies. And yet, these discoveries raise a bigger mystery. Because while South Asian DNA appears in urban lowland sites, it's nearly absent from the Mon Khmer mountain tribes. Why? Did they resist contact? Did their geography protect them? Or did cultural boundaries run so deep they kept gene pools almost entirely separate? We may never know for sure, but the contrast is undeniable. In cities like Angkor, the genes of India flowed in. In the highlands, the old Mon Khmer genome held the line. This gives us something powerful to reflect on, because the story of Southeast Asia is not a single origin. It's not one migration, one people, or one culture. It's a braided river, with Mon Khmer forming the base, and waves from India, China, and the Pacific merging over time. And now the question is this. If we can detect Indian influence this early, and this strongly, how many other hidden migrations have shaped the ancestry of modern Asia? If you're starting to feel like the past is way more interconnected than we were taught, you're absolutely right. So don't stop now. Subscribe if you haven't already, because in the final chapter, we'll uncover how language itself becomes a genetic boundary, shaping who we are and who we think we are. Most people think language is just sound, an invisible thread tying people through words, stories, and dialects. But what if language is more than speech? What if it leaves fingerprints in your DNA? In Southeast Asia, that question isn't just poetic. It's measurable. And the answer turns everything upside down. Let's go to the mountains of northern Thailand. In this single region, multiple ethnic groups live side by side. Some speak Thai. Some speak Mon Khmer. Others speak Hmong Mien. They farm the same soil. They breathe the same air. But when scientists sampled their DNA, they found something completely unexpected. Despite being neighbors, just miles apart, the genetic distances between language groups were more significant than geographic distance. In other words, people living in the same valley, but speaking different languages, were genetically further apart than those living 100 miles away who spoke the same tongue. How is that possible? Because language, in many cases, acts like a genetic firewall. Marriages happen within speech communities. Children are raised with shared rituals, shared myths, shared identity. And over time, those social walls shape biology. This isn't just theory. In one major study, geneticists calculated that linguistic affiliation explained up to 8% of genetic variation between local groups. Geography. Almost nothing. Now imagine what that means. It means that across centuries, language has quietly sculpted the human genome, not through force, but through tradition. Even more fascinating, this pattern shows up inside the Mon Khmer world itself. Take two tribes, say, the Kamu and the Lawa. They both speak Mon Khmer languages, but when you analyze their genes, they don't form one single block. Instead, they form internal clusters that mirror subbranches of their language family. So not only does language shape gene flow, but even dialect trees map. directly onto population structure. I remember reading that in a journal article and just sitting there, stunned, because I realized this isn't about history books anymore. This is about the voice of your ancestors, literally shaping your blood. And the Mon Khmer case is one of the clearest examples in the world. Their languages stretch across vast territory, from the forests of Malaysia to the plateaus of northeast India. But despite that, their genetic coherence remains intact. Why? Because unlike dominant groups who absorbed everyone they met, many Mon Khmer communities stayed tight-knit, marrying within, preserving identity not just through speech, but through reproduction. Now think about the opposite. When Thai-speaking migrants arrived in these same regions around the 13th century, they didn't build walls. They built systems that assimilated. Many Mon Khmer speakers gradually shifted languages. But here's the catch. Their DNA didn't always follow. That's why, in some parts of Thailand today, you'll meet people who identify as Thai, speak Thai, dress Thai, but carry the genome of ancient Austroasiatic ancestors. It's a reminder that language can drift, but genes, they remember, and that memory is not always aligned with identity. So next time someone asks you where you're from, maybe the better question is, where's your DNA still speaking a language your mouth forgot? Let that sit. Because as borders change, as languages die, as people migrate, what we're left with isn't always obvious. But it's there. In patterns, in mutations, in hidden concordances only the genome can reveal. So ask yourself this. If your genes and your language disagree, which one tells the truth? Hit that subscribe button, because if this series taught us anything, it's that history is far messier, deeper, and more beautifully tangled than we ever imagined.